In Buddhism, there is something that sounds, at first hearing, very small. Yet the longer one lives, the more one realizes it is a great doorway. By simply returning to a single breath, a human being can return to oneself. Not returning through loud noise, not through victory, nor through forceful declarations before the world, but through one inhale, one exhale, very gentle, very deep, as though amid all the clamor of life, there still remains a lamp that has never gone out within the human heart. And perhaps in the deeply turbulent century that has just passed, Thich Nhat Hanh was one of the very few people who appeared to remind humanity of that simple truth. He did not enter history by way of swords and spears, nor did he enter the world's memory through the power of a throne or the explosions of revolutions. He came like a distant bell in the early morning, like a thin veil of smoke rising from a temple roof after the rain, like a gentle reminder that, in the midst of war, human beings can still choose peace. In the midst of division, human beings can still learn again how to listen. In the face of the fear of impermanence, human beings can still smile at a cloud and understand that nothing is ever truly lost. The story of Thich Nhat Hanh, therefore, is not merely the story of a Zen master. It is also the story of a man who walked through the fires of his age without allowing his heart to turn to ash. It is the story of a voice softer than gunfire, yet more enduring than gunfire. And it is also the story of how one human being could transform mindfulness into a refuge for millions of weary souls across the world. Tonight, on Deep Sleep of Power, we will walk slowly through that life together, walking as one runs a hand along each old wooden bead, as one opens each small door in a house that has long been asleep. If you love stories told in a slow rhythm, in gentle light, with reflections that can accompany us into sleep, please subscribe to the channel so that you may continue the journey with us. For before he became the one who taught the world how to breathe, he too was once a quiet child standing before the vastness of life, listening to the wind passing through the leaves, listening to the sound of the temple bell dissolving into the early morning mist, and perhaps, from that very early place, a seed had already begun to awaken in silence. There are seeds that are not sown with a loud voice. They fall into life very gently, like a thin veil of mist settling on leaves, like the sound of a temple bell dissolving into the morning, like a wistfulness no one can name in the heart of a child still too young to understand the whole world, yet already sensitive enough to feel that this world holds something both beautiful and sad. Nguyen Xuan Bao came into life in a Vietnam still lying beneath a colonial sky, a sky not always dark, and yet always bearing a heavy layer of cloud suspended above human destiny. There, people still lived, still worked, still loved, still raised their children, still listened to the seasons passing over fields and rooftops. But somewhere in the air, there remained a quiet feeling of oppression, of a nation not yet fully belonging to itself. The childhood of that little boy, therefore, was not only the childhood of an individual, though it was also the childhood of an entire country, learning how to breathe beneath the weight of its times. But what is strange is that in ages filled with unrest, the souls of children are sometimes more sensitive to beauty than anyone else. Perhaps it was precisely in those early years that Nguyen Xuan Bao began to listen to the world, not through the noise of reason, but through the softness of feeling. A temple roof is faintly visible behind the trees, the distant resonance of a bell in the late afternoon, the serene face of the Buddha, a stretch of silence longer than usual between the rhythms of family and social life. All of these things that seem so small are sometimes very deep callings. Many people enter life through ambition. Others enter life through questions. And it seems that from very early on, the boy Nguyen Xuan Bao belonged to the second group. He did not merely see the world as it was. He also felt that somewhere behind its ordinary movements, there must be another path. A path with less noise, but closer to the truth. While many adults around him were perhaps preoccupied with food and clothing, with the times, with status, with survival, within the heart of a child, there quietly arose a very strange longing. The longing to touch a peace that did not depend on circumstances. That is what makes the childhood of Thich Nhat Hanh, when looked back upon, memorable not only because of its historical setting, but also because of the structure of a soul gradually taking shape. A soul that did not reject the sorrow of the world, but also did not wish to let itself be drowned in it. A soul that had already understood, though not yet in words, that human beings cannot live only by reacting to suffering. They must also learn how to look deeply into it, embrace it, and transform it. Perhaps it was precisely because he grew up beneath a colonial sky that he sensed early on an important truth. Outwardly, a human being may be bound, but inwardly, there still remains a sky that must be preserved. When a nation is not yet truly free, each individual has even greater need of an inner refuge in order not to lose one's dignity. For many people, that refuge is family. For many others, it is the homeland. But for the boy Nguyen Xuan Bao, it seems that from very early on, that place had already begun to take on the shape of a door to meditation. We often think that great ideas are born from great books, from great debates, from the years of adulthood that have collided deeply with history. But sometimes, the roots of an entire life of thought lie in a first stirring that even the person experiencing it cannot yet explain. A child standing still in tranquility. A young heart suddenly feeling itself called toward silence. A vague intuition that life is not only competition, not only gain and loss, not only the voices calling from outside. And so, the first seed was sown. It was not yet a theory, not yet a doctrine, not yet the language of mindfulness, of engagement, of reconciliation. At that time, it was only a very small seed. The belief that there must be a way of living more deeply, more gently, more wakefully in the midst of an unsettled world. Later, that seed would grow into teachings that soothed the hearts of millions. But in the beginning, it was only the slight leaning of a young soul toward serenity, like a tender branch always turning toward the light, even when the sky is still heavy with gray clouds. And then, once a seed has truly heard the call of the earth, it cannot remain forever still in the dark interior. Sooner or later, it will find its way upward, very slowly, very quietly, yet decisively, toward the temple roof, toward the bell, toward the first doorway of the monastic life. There are doors that open not with the sound of hinges, but with a very gentle silence in the human heart. For Nguyen Xuan Bao, that door was called Tu Hieu. People often think that entering a temple means stepping out of life. But for that young boy, entering the temple, first of all, meant entering a different rhythm of life. Slower, lower, closer to the ground, and therefore also closer to the truth. There were no splendors there to capture the eyes of the world. Nothing was radiant except the early morning bell, the scent of incense smoke, a thin trace of sunlight across the brick courtyard, the sound of a bamboo broom sweeping over dry leaves, the sound of wooden clogs touching the ground in a morning still heavy with dew. And it was precisely within that setting, seemingly so simple, that a great inner life began to be nurtured. Hieu gave the young novice not only scriptures and rituals. Hieu offered him a much quieter lesson. The way is not outside everyday life. The way is there in carrying water, tending the fire, sweeping the yard, hauling firewood, rinsing rice, and washing bowls. The way is there when feet touch mud, when hands touch straw, when the back bends over humble work. Their mindfulness is not something hung high upon beautiful words, but the ability to be wholly present in the very thing one is doing. It was a very beautiful lesson, and also a very difficult one. Human beings often wish to seek the sacred only in places separated from dust and soil. We easily imagine that peace exists only in moments of purity, when life outside has not yet had time to knock on the door. But that temple seems to have taught the young novice another truth. True peace is not escaping mud and earth, but passing through mud and earth without letting the heart lose its clarity. Thus the youth of Thich Nhat Hanh at Hieu should not be imagined as days spent only sitting quietly beneath the temple eaves, listening to the wind. They were also days of labor, very real, very human. Small tasks repeated again and again, routines seemingly monotonous, quiet disciplines for which no one clapped in praise. Yet from these very things, another kind of strength began to grow. The strength of steadiness, of patience, of the ability to live deeply within the ordinary. Perhaps later, when he taught the whole world how to breathe, how to walk, how to eat a meal in mindfulness, the roots of those teachings did not lie in lofty theories. They had been learned very early, in the temple courtyard, by the fire in the kitchen, among the gardens and fields, through hands touching everyday work. One may read many books in order to speak of presence, but sometimes a young novice learns presence by washing a bowl until it is clean, sweeping a stretch of courtyard until it is still, or walking from the kitchen to the meditation hall without letting the mind run ahead of the feet. That is what gives this journey its special character. The depth of Thich Nhat Hanh was shaped not only by hours of meditation set apart from the world, but also by the sweat of labor, by the discipline of communal living, by the very concrete contact between body and earth. At Hieu, that young novice did not learn how to become a person detached from the world in the sense of floating above life. On the contrary, he learned how to stand firmly within life, to walk very slowly through mud and earth while still preserving clear eyes. That is a rare capacity, for each of us, sooner or later, must pass through mud and earth in one way or another. Some pass through it by illness, some by old age, some by war, exile, loneliness, or by years in which they no longer recognize themselves amid the upheavals of the times. Mud and earth are not found only in fields and gardens. They are also the weariness clinging to the mind, the thoughts heavy as endless rain, the collisions that make human beings so easily lose their gentleness. Perhaps it was precisely because he learned so early to walk slowly through such very real things that Thich Nhat Hanh was later able to speak to the world in a voice at once so gentle and so steady. At Hieu, he also learned something else, equally quiet and enduring. Smallness is never trivial. A falling leaf, a bowl of rice eaten slowly, a footstep placed properly upon the earth. All of these can become the beginning of awakening. With such a way of seeing, life is no longer divided into the sacred and the ordinary. Everything can become a doorway if one enters it with mindfulness. In other words, Hieu was not merely training a monk. It was quietly preparing for the birth of a very great idea that would come later. That human beings do not need to wait until life is perfect in order to live deeply. We can touch peace right in the midst of what is unfinished, right in the midst of soiled work, right in the midst of utterly ordinary days. And that, too, is the hidden beauty of this temple. It did not construct a world opposed to ordinary human life. It taught a young novice how to bring light into ordinary human life, beginning with tasks so small that people in the world often pass them by. There are seeds that grow in sunlight. There are seeds that grow in the rain. And there are seeds that truly take root only when buried in the earth, tested by hardship, discipline, and silence. Nguyen Xuan Bao grew in that way at Hieu, not hurrying to bloom, not displaying his colors, but quietly sending his roots deeper into the soil of life. And the time would come when, as the world outside burned bright with division, hatred, and the noise of history, those very small lessons learned from the temple courtyard, the kitchen fire, and the muddy paths would no longer be merely the provisions of a young monk. They would become the lamp by which he stepped into a far greater question. When life is in flames, what can the way do besides stand and watch? There are ages that force human beings to question again what they believe most deeply. When the sky is calm, anyone can speak of compassion. When the wind is gentle, anyone can sit still and think that peace is something real. But when war passes over rooftops, when villages begin to lose the sound of roosters and fill with the sound of weeping, when fire is no longer on the lamp's flame but has spread into the fields, into the body, into human memory, then the question becomes far more severe. What will Buddhism do before a world that is burning? Will it simply stand and watch? That was perhaps one of the greatest questions that passed through the mind of Thich Nhat Hanh during the years when the country was submerged in division and sorrow. And it is precisely here that the distinctiveness of his thought begins to emerge clearly. For he did not accept a kind of peace built by turning one's back on human suffering. He understood that if the meditation hall were truly a place that nourished insight, then that insight could not shine only on the altar, in the sound of the wooden bell, in the incense smoke, and then go dark as soon as one stepped outside the temple gate. For him, looking deeply into suffering was not to avoid it, but to know what one must do with it. Thus, in the midst of an age when people were easily pulled toward two extremes, either rushing into hatred or withdrawing into safe silence, Thich Nhat Hanh chose a more difficult path: to remain with the spirit of the Dharma, yet allow the Dharma to step onto the dirt road, to enter infirmaries, schools, refugee camps, devastated villages, and the hearts of people who were afraid. That was not a noisy act, nor was it the kind of courage that likes to display itself before history. It was like a lamp carried out into a windy night. That light did not roar. It simply and quietly kept the darkness from swallowing the human face whole. Here, we begin to see clearly why the years at Hieu were so important. A person who has learned how to walk slowly through mud and earth, who has learned how to keep the mind steady in each small task, will understand that relieving suffering does not always begin with grand slogans. Sometimes it begins by bandaging a wound, rebuilding a roof, listening to a mother who has lost her child without hastily interrupting with advice, sitting down beside pain instead of explaining it from some dry and distant place. Perhaps that is why the path he later opened came to be called engaged Buddhism. But the word engaged here, if we look carefully, does not carry the impatient energy of plunging into life in order to claim victory. It is the stepping forward of a heart that cannot bear to remain still before suffering. It is compassion that knows how to walk on 2 feet. It is understanding that knows how to bend down with 2 hands. It is meditation that does not close its door to the world, but opens the door so that the world may be a little less cold. This sounds gentle, but in truth, it is very strong. In brutal years, people often believe in loud voices, in factions, in the power of confrontation. A slow voice, a call for reconciliation, a way of seeing that refuses to turn human beings into one another's enemies. Such things are easily regarded as too soft, too fragile, even too naive. But Thich Nhat Hanh seems to have seen what many people, in the frenzy of rage, could no longer see. That war does not kill human beings only with bombs and bullets. It also kills by teaching human beings to lose the ability to look at one another as fellow beings. And if Buddhism is to be present in life, then first of all it must be present at precisely that point of rupture. He did not want a spirituality that only knew how to comfort isolated souls while forgetting the structures of suffering surrounding them. But neither did he want engagement to become a new form of anger clothed in ideals. Between those 2 shores, he walked like someone carrying a full bowl of water across a trembling bridge. Slowly, steadily, mindfully, and understanding that if it tilted even slightly, both the water and the moon's reflection within it could be lost. Perhaps that is why, in Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dharma and life do not cancel one another out. They illuminate one another. It is precisely because he loved life that he needed the depth of meditative practice all the more, so as not to be swept away by life. It is precisely because he preserved that inner depth that he could step into life without turning himself into part of the storm. This is a very profound lesson for every age, including our own. Human beings do not necessarily have to choose between peace and responsibility. A heart that is steady enough can hold both. For today's audience, especially those who have passed through many upheavals of their own, this perhaps touches a very real place. For everyone at some point has seen life burn in one way or another. It is not always war in the streets. Sometimes it is an illness in the home, a separation, a loneliness that arrives late in old age, the feeling of watching a world change too quickly for one's heart to keep pace. In such moments, we too must face a similar question. Shall we withdraw into ourselves or keep the heart open without letting it shatter? Thich Nhat Hanh lived in order to answer that question with his very life. He showed that the most beautiful act is not always the largest act. Sometimes the greatest thing is not to let one's heart grow hard in a hard age, not to let another person's pain become merely a passing news item, not to let spiritual practice become a refuge reserved only for oneself. Compassion, if it is real, will sooner or later wish to step outside the door. But to step outside without losing oneself, that is another art. When the flames of the world rise high, people need not only hands to work, but also an inner place, quiet enough not to burn with what they are trying to extinguish. And as if from the midst of ashes, a very quiet lesson is appearing. Before one can embrace the suffering of an age, one perhaps must first learn how to return to the rhythm of one's own breath. There are things in life so great that it takes people many years to recognize them. But there are also things so small that we often pass them by, until one day suffering forces us to stop and see that it is precisely that very small thing which is the first doorway leading us back to ourselves. For Thich Nhat Hanh, one such doorway was the breath. It sounds so simple that it hardly seems like a discovery at all. Who does not breathe? Who does not live by those silent rhythms of inhaling and exhaling? But in the midst of war, in an age when human beings were being torn apart by bad news, separation, fear, and loss, the breath suddenly ceased to be something self-evident. It became the last place to which a person could still return when everything else was trembling. War not only devastates villages, bodies, and memory, it also destroys the inner rhythm of human beings. It makes the heart beat faster, the mind run farther, fear grow larger, and presence become more fragile. Those who live through war do not suffer only because of bombs and bullets. They also suffer because they are pulled away from themselves. The mind keeps running toward the terrible thing about to happen, or becomes trapped in the painful thing that has just happened, until the present moment, the only place where life is truly taking place, suddenly becomes unfamiliar. Perhaps it was precisely in that context that Thich Nhat Hanh perceived a very profound truth. If human beings no longer know how to remain with a single breath, then they also very easily lose the ability to remain with their own pain in a calm, gentle, and lucid way. Thus, in his thought, the breath was not merely a technique for relaxation. It was a small key that opened onto a vast sky. Small, because it is always there, very near, very ordinary, requiring no preparation at all. Vast, because from that breath, another world can open, a world in which human beings are no longer carried away entirely by panic, a world in which we can recognize, I am sad, but I am not only that sadness. I am afraid, but I am not completely swallowed by that fear. Outside there may be chaos, yet in here there still remains a quiet space on which to rely. That is what makes Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching on the breath both gentle and strong. He did not promise that one mindful breath would make war disappear, nor was he naive enough to believe that simply sitting still would cause all the suffering of the age to dissolve on its own. What he saw more clearly was this: if human beings do not have a place of refuge within, then even when they wish to help the world, they can very easily be worn down by it, embittered by it, or lose their direction within it. The breath, in that sense, is not a retreat from reality. It is a way of standing upon the ground of reality without collapsing. In truth, this is very close to the experience of many people, especially viewers who have passed through a turbulent youth. Perhaps we do not call it mindfulness, nor do we use the language of meditation practice, but who among us has never had a moment in life when we had to stop, tell ourselves to breathe a little more slowly, sit a little more still, so as not to break into tears, not to erupt in anger, not to fall into despair. There are times when one slow breath is the boundary between breaking apart and enduring one more day. Thich Nhat Hanh elevated that deeply human moment into a way of life. From that point on, the breath was no longer an unconscious biological act, but became an act of inner freedom. When we breathe consciously, we begin to reclaim the right to dwell within our own body and mind. We no longer allow the world to determine the rhythm within us entirely. We return to our steps, to our body, to our presence, and from that presence, many other things can begin. Listening more deeply, loving with less clumsiness, acting with less haste, and suffering with less loneliness. Perhaps that is why, later on, amid so many vast ideas, so many talks, so many books, What remained longest with millions of people around the world were still the most fundamental things. Breathing in, knowing that one is breathing in. Breathing out, knowing that one is breathing out. The sentence sounds like a small stream, but sometimes it is precisely a small stream that has enough patience to flow through stone. Here, the depth of Thich Nhat Hanh reveals itself once more. He did not build his thought first from distant concepts, and only afterwards sought to apply them to life. He began with the thing closest to every human being, the breath. From there, he gradually opened out into a very broad philosophy of living, returning to the present moment, caring for body and mind, not letting the mind remain exiled for too long, and learning how to touch deeply the life that is present right here and now. In a world that favors grand solutions, such an invitation may seem too small, but perhaps it is precisely because it is small that it endures. Not everyone can change their age, not everyone can stop the storms out there, but everyone still has a breath to which one may return, and sometimes a true peace for a human life must begin with something that is humble. In the midst of war, discovering the breath was not an escape. It was a form of very quiet courage, the courage not to be swept away, the courage to keep the inner lamp from going out, the courage to continue loving while the world is teaching human beings fear and defensiveness. And then, from that very small key, the door did not open for only one person. Once someone has found a rhythm of breathing steady enough to pass through storms, one will naturally wish to invite others into the same atmosphere, where peace is no longer the private possession of an individual, but begins to become a shared rhythm of life for souls seeking refuge in one another. When a person has found a breath deep enough not to be swept away by life, the next natural step is not to keep that peace for oneself alone. Peace, if it is real, usually does not like to be alone. It wishes to spread like lamplight in the night, like the fragrance of warm tea in a house where many people are weary, like a hand resting lightly on another's shoulder without needing to say too much. Perhaps that is why, from those years of fire, smoke, and wakefulness, there gradually appeared in the heart of Thich Nhat Hanh a very beautiful dream. Not only that one individual would know how to return to the breath, but that a community might learn how to live without abandoning one another in the midst of suffering. That dream bore the name Phuong Boy. At first hearing, it may sound like only the name of a place, an experiment, a stage along the way. But if we look more deeply, Phuong Boy was something gentler and greater than that. It was the first effort to transform what Thich Nhat Hanh had felt, had learned, had lived into a shared space. A place where people came not merely to take shelter from the world, but to learn how to remain with the world through a heart less wounded, more luminous, and more capable of relying on one another. In an age when war made people quick to distrust one another, quick to withdraw, quick to think first of saving themselves, the idea of a community that knew how to carry one another through suffering was, in truth, a very bold idea. For it required people to believe once again in what history was steadily eroding, that we do not necessarily have to exist as lonely islands, that healing is not only the private work of each soul inside a closed room, and that there are sorrows that truly begin to soften only when they are placed within the wider embrace of a sangha, of friendship, of shared labor, shared silence, and meals eaten in true presence. Phuong Boy, therefore, was not a romantic dream separated from reality. It was born precisely from the very real pain of human life, from separation, from exhaustion, from souls cracked by war, to the point that they no longer knew how to live kindly with one another without causing further hurt. Thich Nhat Hanh saw very clearly that if one spoke only to each individual, saying, "Be at peace, breathe, be mindful," that would still not be enough. Human beings need a living environment that knows how to support those practices. They need a place where gentleness is not regarded as weakness. They need a rhythm of life in which listening to one another becomes as natural as sweeping the yard, cooking rice, or watering the plants. That is the particular beauty of Phuong Boy. There, the ideal did not hover too high above human heads. It rested in things very close to the ground. A daily life that was orderly but not rigid. A community with discipline that did not lose its humanity. A shared life in which each person learned to care for one's own mind, while at the same time not forgetting to care for the atmosphere around oneself, so that others, too, could breathe more easily. It could be said that from very early on, Thich Nhat Hanh understood something that the modern world would only later begin to recognize. Personal suffering and the communal environment are never separate from one another. If all around us there is only haste, judgment, tension, and isolation, then even a person of goodwill who wishes to live deeply will easily grow weary. But if there is a community that knows how to walk slowly, how to listen, how to do small things together while supporting one another, then the heart will not have to strain so much. For that reason, Phuong Boy was not merely a place. It was a first sketch of what would later become one of the pillars of Thich Nhat Hanh's thought. Sangha, the community of practice, is not a secondary part of the path, but part of the path itself. A person may begin with one's own breath, but to travel far through the long nights of suffering, human beings often need to walk beside others. This touches very deeply upon life today, and perhaps touches even more deeply the hearts of viewers who have lived long enough to understand that age does not make loneliness disappear on its own. Sometimes, the more years pass, the more one realizes that suffering becomes heaviest, not necessarily because it is large, but because one must hold it alone. A mild illness can turn into a long night if there is no voice asking after us. An old sorrow can smolder for decades if it has never been laid to rest in a safe enough place. Thich Nhat Hanh saw this very early, and Phuong Boy, in one sense, was his gentle yet deeply lucid answer. Human beings were not born to carry every pain alone. Of course, building such a community was not easy at all. Wherever there are human beings, there are differences, frictions, and quiet egos wanting to be given priority. But perhaps that is precisely why this dream is all the more precious. It was not built upon the illusion that human beings are already perfect, but upon the faith that human beings can learn to live with one another more kindly, learn very slowly, very humbly, through the way one steps, the way one speaks, the way one listens, the way one remains silent. Phuong Boy did not try to create flawless human beings. It tried to create a patch of earth where cracks were not a source of shame, where practice was not mistaken for achievement, and where suffering was not pushed to the edge of the door as something inconvenient. Seen in that way, Phuong Boy was one of the most beautiful early dreams of Thich Nhat Hanh, the dream that compassion could take the shape of a community, that mindfulness could bloom not only in the meditation hall, but also in the way human beings sit with one another through difficult seasons. That healing is not only the affair of the individual soul, but also the art of creating a space in which no one is forgotten. And then, like every beautiful dream, it could not remain forever still within one valley or one familiar embrace. Sooner or later, What had been nurtured there would have to step farther out, to meet a wider sky, where the ideas of homeland, community, and refuge would begin to be tested by the roads of separation, unfamiliar horizons, and the very quiet pain of one who must learn how to carry home within the heart itself. There are departures that do not begin with the ambition to conquer a new horizon, but with a quiet sorrow. When one's homeland is too near, one sometimes sees only the wounds on its surface, but when one stands a little farther away, in the distance of longing, solitude, and long nights in a foreign land, one begins at last to see the true depth of what one belongs to. For Thich Nhat Hanh, the years spent far from home seem to have carried such a meaning. To leave, in this case, was not to abandon the homeland. On the contrary, it was to carry the homeland with him. In every longing, every reflection, every silent moment of gazing at another sky, while still hearing somewhere the old bell echoing back from within memory. There are people who remain very close to their homeland, yet whose souls have long drifted far away. And there are also those who stand in another country, hear another language, walk along other roads, yet whose hearts still ache with the pain of their native land, as if every cold wind were reminding them of something that has not yet been allowed to heal. Those years could not have been easy. Life in a foreign land always carries within it a particular emptiness. It is not only a matter of different weather, different food, and different ways of living. The greater difficulty lies in the fact that one suddenly becomes a creature standing between two shores. The body is present in one place, but the deepest part of the heart remains in another. One learns how to smile, to work, to enter into dialogue, to continue walking in the new world. Yet at a deeper level, there still flows an unceasing current of remembrance, like an underground river no one sees, yet which nourishes an entire region of grass and trees. Perhaps it was precisely in such years far from home that Thich Nhat Hanh came to see more clearly that the homeland is not merely a piece of land. The homeland is also language, collective suffering, the people who are not present, here and yet still live in each of one's breaths. When we are very near, we easily think of the homeland as something self-evident, like air, like light. Only when we go far away do we begin to understand that there are things we have long lived within without ever truly naming them. And it was that very distance that made his vision deeper. When one is close to an event, one is often swept up in its noise. From farther away, one can begin to see the deeper layers beneath it, not only the spectacle of war, but the structures of fear, not only the conflict between factions, but the quiet suffering of ordinary people crushed between the wheels of history. Not only the question of who wins and who loses, but the far more difficult question, how can a nation survive without losing its soul? Exile in that sense gave him not only geographical distance, it gave him a reflective distance of consciousness. Within that distance, many things began to take shape more clearly. The lessons from Hieu, the stirrings of Phuong boy, the questions about engaged Buddhism, about the breath, about community, about war. None of these disappeared when he left his homeland. On the contrary, they seem to have settled, crystallized, like sediment sinking through many nights, until the bottom of the water becomes clearer. There are thoughts that truly take form only when one is no longer surrounded by too much noise. And there are pains of the nation that can truly be understood only when one sits very still in a foreign place, allowing them to pass through the heart like a long rain. But those years were not only a time of longing, they were also a time of dialogue. When he stepped into the wider world, Thich Nhat Hanh not only saw his homeland more deeply, he also began to see the homeland in relation to the shared suffering of humanity. Everywhere there is anxiety. Everywhere there is division. Everywhere there are societies so busy that they lose the capacity to listen to one another through compassion. That perhaps made his vision increasingly less narrow. Vietnam was no longer only a separate story to be told like a wartime report. Vietnam became a mirror reflecting a larger problem. When human beings forget how to breathe, how to stop, how to see one another as fellow beings, then anywhere, under any name, tragedy can repeat itself. That is why the years in a foreign land did not dilute his thoughts. On the contrary, they made it broader while preserving its roots. He did not dissolve into the world in order to forget his origins. He carried his origins into the world like carrying a small flame, and then learned how to let that flame illuminate questions of a more universal kind. This is a very rare form of maturity, to go far without losing oneself, to open the heart to the world without diluting the pain of one's homeland. Perhaps those who have lived long enough all understand this. Sometimes one must leave a place before one can truly love it. One must pass through loss before understanding how the things once too familiar had nourished one all along. One must step into loneliness before recognizing how precious community is. And one must stand in the silence of a foreign land before hearing clearly the quiet call rising from one's own roots. Those years, therefore, were not merely a wandering chapter in the life of a monk far from home. They were a stage of ripening vision, a vision less heated, less hurried, less bound to immediate reaction, and for that very reason, deeper, more compassionate, and more enduring in its pain for the nation. Not a pain that flares up and quickly burns out, but a pain that has settled into responsibility. From afar, he looked upon the homeland as one standing on a high hill, looking down at a familiar river through the early morning mist, no longer seeing only the glittering surface near the bank, but beginning to see the bends, the eroded muddy stretches, the places where the water is blocked, the places where the current still quietly finds its way onward. And when one looks that deeply, it becomes hard to remain satisfied with voices that are too simple. For there are wounds that cannot be healed by choosing one side in order to hate the other. There are wounds of a nation that require another kind of voice, slower, lonelier, yet also more deeply human, as though from within the distance of exile, amid long nights, listening to unfamiliar winds pass across the window frame, a new tone was gradually taking shape, not the voice of pure condemnation, nor the voice of weak compromise, but a voice that wished to embrace the human being on both shores of division before they sank completely into one another's darkness. There are ages in which the world seems to offer human beings only two choices: stand on this side or stand on that side. Both sides call themselves just. Both sides have their own arguments. Both sides speak in voices full of certainty. And in between, where ordinary people are losing their homes, losing their loved ones, losing their youth, even losing the ability to sleep peacefully through a whole night. The sound of weeping is often quieter than the sound of slogans. It was in such an age that Thich Nhat Hanh chose to raise a third voice. It was not the voice of hesitation, nor was it the posture of standing outside in order to keep oneself clean. Still less was it the safe cleverness of someone trying to please everyone. No, that voice was far more difficult than that. It was the choice to step directly into the very center of division, while still refusing to look at human beings through the eyes of hatred. It was a way of saying, I see the suffering on both sides. I will not become complicit in violence simply because that violence bears a flag familiar to me. I do not accept that human beings should be turned into instruments for ideas greater than their own lives. It was a very lonely path. In war, people often want answers that are clear and brief. They want to know which side you belong to. They want to know who you call a friend and who you call an enemy. They want to know whether you are willing to speak in the language of anger. A slow voice, a gaze unwilling to divide the world into two absolute halves, an invitation to listen to the suffering even of those on the other side. Such things are easily misunderstood as weakness, vagueness, even betrayal. But in truth, to speak in that way, a person must be far stronger than their gentle appearance suggests. Thich Nhat Hanh understood that if one chooses to love only one side, then that love is still too narrow. If one protects only the pain of those who are like oneself, while ignoring the pain of those placed on the opposite side, then compassion has not yet reached its own furthest edge. And if Buddhism truly teaches human beings to look deeply into the interdependent nature of life, then no one can be cut out of the field of love merely because history has placed them on another front. That is what gives his voice its moral depth. He did not deny the reality of violence. He did not soften what war inflicted. He did not paint suffering in rosy colors. But he also refused to let that suffering become the reason for a new indifference. He chose a harder path, to keep the heart open even while the world was teaching human beings to close it. It sounds gentle, but this is a rare form of courage. For love, in the thought of Thich Nhat Hanh, was never a weak emotion used merely to console. It was a power of very deep seeing. When one sees deeply enough, one begins to understand that behind political labels, behind uniforms, slogans, and ideologies, there are still human beings who are afraid, who are wounded, who are growing up inside stories that make them believe they must oppose one another. To see that deeply does not mean accepting violence. On the contrary, it makes one see the tragedy of violence even more clearly. Violence not only kills people, it also damages the way human beings imagine one another. Therefore, the third voice was not a voice without a position. It had a very clear position: to stand on the side of life. To stand with those lives crushed between the machinery of history. To stand with the possibility of reconciliation before every bridge is burned. And more deeply still, to stand with human dignity. Something that should not be defined entirely by the factions into which people are pushed. If we think carefully, this does not belong only to some distant time of war. It also touches our own age in a very quiet yet very real way. For though not everyone lives amid bombs and bullets, many people are living amid other kinds of crossfire. Divisions within the family, confrontation in society, extremism online, judgments that come too quickly, and conclusions drawn too harshly. People easily choose sides, easily grow angry, and easily see those who disagree with them as threats rather than as human beings. In such an atmosphere, the lesson of Thich Nhat Hanh still shines like a lamp placed low upon the floor. Not everyone who speaks softly is weak. Sometimes, only those who are truly steady still have the strength to speak through love amid voices trying to erase one another. For older audiences, perhaps this is a part that touches especially deeply. Once one has lived long enough, one often understands that not every argument requires a winner. Not every sorrow is softened by raising one's voice. There are wounds in a human life, in marriage, in family, in memories carried for many years, that begin to heal only when someone is willing to sit down, stop insisting on being right, and ask a deeper question: how can we hurt one another less? Thich Nhat Hanh placed that question in the middle of the war, and for that very reason, his voice carried both the beauty of a sutra and the weight of a political choice in the deepest sense, not allowing human beings to be swallowed by the ruthless logic of confrontation. He did not stand in the middle out of vagueness. He stood in the middle to preserve a bridge easily suspected by both sides, and yet without it, the abyss would only grow deeper. Perhaps that is why this journey becomes less and less like the story of a solitary monk, and more the story of a conscience that knows that love is not something valuable only in peaceful days. It is precisely in the days when human beings most want to turn away from one another that love reveals its true form as a great, luminous, and disciplined force. But a voice, no matter how deep, if it resounds alone, can still be lost in the winds of its age. The time would come when that path would meet another heart across the ocean, a heart also restless before violence, also searching for a moral language wide enough to embrace the human being without bowing before hatred. And when two rivers recognize one another, the waters of history sometimes begin to change their course. There are encounters in history that are not merely encounters between two human beings. They are like the moment when two rivers, after flowing far through different lands, suddenly recognize that they are both moving toward the same great sea. One river has passed through temple bells, meditation huts, and villages torn apart by war. The other has passed through churches, streets heavy with racial injustice, and marches for human dignity. On one side is a monk from Vietnam. On the other hand, there is a minister from America. And between them, what binds things together is not only thought, but a remarkably similar anguish: how to protect life without surrendering to hatred. When Thich Nhat Hanh met Martin Luther King Jr., it was not simply a meeting between East and West, between Buddhism and Christianity, between a brown robe and a black suit. It was a meeting between two souls who had both looked too long into human suffering not to understand that, without a love wide enough, history would go on turning like a millstone, crushing fragile human lives. One spoke in the language of mindfulness, of the breath, of footsteps upon the earth. The other spoke in the language of the gospel, of justice, of the dream of equality. But at the deepest level, both were protecting the same thing: the right to live as a whole human being, not to be turned into an instrument of violence, racism, or ideology. Perhaps the most beautiful thing in that meeting was that they did not need to be the same in order to understand one another. They came from two different traditions, two different symbolic worlds, two very different histories. But when people who have truly gone deeply into human suffering meet one another, they often recognize one another very quickly, not first through argument, but through something quieter. I know why you cannot sleep peacefully before this suffering. I know why you still have to speak out, even though speaking out may cause you to be misunderstood, isolated, or made to pay a price. That is a very rare kind of brotherhood, not a brotherhood based on shared blood, nationality, religion, or interest, but a brotherhood woven from moral responsibility. Two human beings standing on opposite shores of the ocean, yet both understanding that silence before injustice is also a way of allowing injustice to continue growing. Both understand that the struggle for peace cannot be only a political reaction, but must also be a deep spiritual practice. Otherwise, Even the one who struggles may easily be swallowed by the anger one is trying to transcend. And perhaps in Martin Luther King Jr., Thich Nhat Hanh saw another version of what had long weighed upon his heart, a human being trying to use love to resist a system sustained by fear. And in Thich Nhat Hanh, Martin Luther King Jr. perhaps also saw a spiritual brother, a voice from a distant east, yet strangely close in the way it refused to let the heart be poisoned by the very evil it stood against. In a century full of alliances formed for power, this meeting was especially beautiful because it was an alliance for conscience. It showed that compassion has no national border, that the suffering of one people, if seen deeply enough, can awaken the heart of another people. Those who truly love human beings do not love only their own people, but have the capacity to widen the circle of concern to include lives that seem very far away. This is something profoundly important in the journey of Thich Nhat Hanh. From this point onward, his voice was no longer only a voice for Vietnam, though Vietnam always remained in his heart. It began to resound like a bell for all humanity. Do not let yourself become cruel simply because the age is cruel. The brotherhood between the two men also carried another kind of beauty. It proved that religion, when it reaches depth, does not divide human beings, but brings them together. A monk and a minister, if standing only on the surface of doctrine, might easily see their differences, but when they descend together into the depths of suffering, justice, and love, they are no longer two opposing symbols. They become two lamps, lighting one another through the same long night of history. For viewers who have lived many years, this is perhaps a passage especially capable of softening the heart. For the longer one moves through life, the more one understands. The most precious thing is not to meet someone who is like oneself in every detail, but to meet someone who understands one's deepest concern. There is someone very far away, speaking another language, living in another culture, and yet when that person speaks, one knows that he is guarding a flame, very much like the flame in one's own heart. That is a great blessing in life. That meeting also highlights a very deep quality in Thich Nhat Hanh. He did not build his path as a closed road. He went deeply enough into the Buddhist tradition to meet what is most universal in all great traditions: love, truth, dignity, and the capacity to transform suffering without creating new suffering. For that reason, he did not become smaller when he stepped out into the world. On the contrary, the more he encountered other great souls, the more clearly his own depth revealed itself. But history is often not generous toward voices that wish to build bridges. Such people may be respected in one place, listened to in another, and yet at the same time may easily be pushed away by the times from the very land they love most. And sometimes, after finding a brother on the far side of the ocean, one must learn a far more painful lesson, that there are days when the homeland no longer opens its door to welcome one back in footsteps, but remains only as a house carried within memory, within the breath, and within a longing that never ceases to be quiet. There are losses that arrive very loudly, like a door slammed shut before one's eyes, like the sound of wind sweeping through a room that has just been emptied of people. But there are also losses that arrive very quietly. They do not immediately disturb the surface of life. They only slowly alter the meaning of the most familiar words. And perhaps one of the most painful words when its meaning is changed is the word home. For Thich Nhat Hanh, there was a period of life in which the homeland was still there. The country was still there. The temple roof, the road, the voice, the sky of earlier days were still there. Yet he could not return. It is a very particular sorrow known to those who live in exile. The thing one loves most does not disappear. It merely recedes beyond reach. It still lives in memory with all its colors, sounds, and fragrances intact. Yet it is no longer a place to which one's feet can naturally return. Being forbidden to return was not only a return was political event. For a person like Thich Nhat Hanh, it was also a very deep inner trial. When human beings are separated from the place that raised them, they do not lose geography alone. They may also lose their sense of belonging. And for many people, the sense of belonging is the final thin blanket that keeps the soul warm in a world that is vast and cold. Perhaps it was precisely in those years that the word home began to change within him. Home was no longer only a temple in Hieu, no longer only the familiar bell in the early morning, the sound of rain falling on an old tiled roof, or the shadow of bamboo leaning over a childhood path. Home, if it is only a location on a map, is too fragile before the upheavals of history. A decision from outside can take it away from our lives. A turn in the times can lock the road back. If one relies entirely on a place, sooner or later one will have to live in fear. Fear of losing it, fear of distance, fear that one day that door will no longer open. But Thich Nhat Hanh seems not to have allowed that sorrow to harden his heart. He passed through exile in a very particular way, not denying the wound, yet also not allowing the wound to become the sole center of his life. He was sorrowful, of course, surely sorrowful very deeply. Only those who truly love the homeland can understand what it means to carry an entire country in one's heart without being allowed to set foot on its soil. But he did not turn that sorrow into bitterness. That bitterness which so easily grows in souls harshly treated by history. Instead, he did what only souls that have practiced very deeply can do. He continued to care for the pain without allowing it to poison the rest of the heart. That is a very rare kind of strength. Ordinarily, when the road home is blocked, people tend to respond in one of two ways. Either they close their hearts in order to hurt less, or they keep that pain as a flame of anger, feeding it day after day until they themselves are consumed. But the path of Thich Nhat Hanh was different. He seems to have learned how to carry the homeland into his breath, his footsteps, every community he built, every talk, every page of writing, every walking meditation on foreign soil. At that point, home was no longer only the place where one was born. Home became a quality of presence. We are at home when we are truly present with ourselves. We are at home when body and mind are no longer running off in two different directions. We are at home when, in a foreign land, we still preserve the roots of compassion, mindfulness, and longing without allowing that longing to turn into resentment. This is a very great lesson, yet it is spoken in a very gentle voice. For many people, especially viewers who have passed into the latter half of life, home also changes meaning in different ways. Some lose their old home because of war, poverty, or the times. Some still have a home, but no longer have loved ones within it. Some live in the very room they have always known, and yet still feel within themselves like exiles. Old age, too, is sometimes a quiet kind of exile. Human beings gradually move away from the body once familiar, away from the old rhythm of life, away from former versions of themselves. In all these displacements, the question of Thich Nhat Hanh becomes very close. If home is no longer a certain place, then what shall we rely upon? He answered not with a dry doctrine, but with his very life. Build your home in the place no one can confiscate. In mindfulness, in Sangha, in the capacity to return to the present moment, in the life that is present, right here. This is not a word of self-consolation. It is a discovery of spiritual depth and also of great practicality. For the outer world can always change. Borders may close. Regimes may change. Things that seem enduring may also dissolve. But a person who has learned how to breathe properly, walk properly, and live in true presence wherever that person may be, still has an inner home in which to take shelter from the rain. That does not make the pain disappear entirely, but it makes the pain wander less. Perhaps that is why the years in which he was not allowed to return did not make Thich Nhat Hanh smaller. On the contrary, they made his vision broader, softer, and deeper. He began to speak to the world not only as a Vietnamese man who loved his homeland, but as a human being who understood to the marrow the feeling of displacement in modern humanity. Many people today, though they have never been forbidden entry into their homeland, still live like people without a home. Homeless in body and mind, homeless in relationships, homeless in a civilization that is too hurried and noisy. For that reason, his story reaches beyond his own history. It touches the very universal human sorrow of being out of place. And then, from that condition of exile, something else quietly began to sprout. When a person can no longer return home by the old road, one sometimes begins to build new bridges through language, through practice, through instructions simple enough that anyone may find a way back to inner peace. As though from the emptiness of exile, page after page was gradually opening, so that one day, countless strangers around the world would receive from him a small key, and for the first time in a very long while, learn again how to return to themselves. There are books that enter life in the form of a great work. They arrive with reputation, with resonance, with the feeling that they are trying to explain an entire world. But there are also pages of writing that enter the human heart as lightly as a letter placed by the window at dusk, not loud, not raising their voice, only slender enough for the weary to pick up, and deep enough that when they close it, they feel their heart has changed, if only a little. The Miracle of Mindfulness is such a book. In truth, what is remarkable is not that it speaks of things that are too unfamiliar. On the contrary, it reminds human beings to return to what is nearest: the breath, the footsteps, the cup of tea, the bowl being washed, the sound of the bell, the present moment. But precisely because these things are so near, we often forget them. We live in life as though merely passing through it. We eat without tasting, walk without arriving, and look without truly seeing. We live in one room while the mind drifts elsewhere, toward something already lost, something not yet arrived, some worry waiting outside the door. And then, in a world accustomed to praising grand things, Thich Nhat Hanh quietly told human beings that perhaps the miracle does not lie in walking on water or flying through the air. The true miracle may simply be walking on the earth and knowing that one is walking. It is a very gentle sentence. But the longer one lives, the deeper it seems. For a human life, in the end, is woven from very small things. A morning of waking without feeling that one's heart has already been pulled too far away. A meal eaten slowly. A moment of sitting quietly by the window. A time when one can name one's sadness without letting it carry one away. If such small things are lived with presence, then life as a whole gradually becomes different. But if they pass by in distraction, then even long years can dissolve like a thin cloud no one had time to look up and notice. What makes the miracle of mindfulness so special is this: it does not require human beings to become someone else before they begin. It does not tell you that you must first understand all of Buddhist philosophy, withdraw into the mountains, or wait until life becomes less turbulent before you can practice. No, the book opens its door very low, very near, very compassionately. It tells the busy person that he can begin while washing the dishes. It tells the anxious person that she can begin with a single breath. It tells the weary person that there is no need to wait for life to become less noisy before touching peace. Perhaps that is why the work traveled so far. A thin letter, and yet it opened a door for millions of people across the world. Not because it promised something magnificent, but because it restored to human beings something that modern civilization so easily takes away: the right to be present in one's own life. For many people, especially those who have lived through many years, this touches something very deep. For there is a quiet sorrow in adulthood, and especially in old age, the feeling that life has passed too quickly. Busy days follow one another. Burdens are piling up. Great and small events are passing like the wind. At some point, we suddenly sit down and realize that perhaps we have lived a great deal, and yet we were not always truly there for our own lives. It is precisely then that the teaching of Thich Nhat Hanh becomes as gentle as a hand resting on the shoulder. It is not too late. Come back. This moment is still here. That is the hidden beauty of the book. It does not overwhelm human beings. It makes them lighter. It does not compel. It invites. It does not reproach us for having lived too hurriedly, but merely opens a small window so that fresh air may enter. And in that current of air, we begin to notice again the things that have always been here. The bird song outside the eaves, the light upon the table, the heartbeat in the chest, the life still continuing in a body grown old, yet still warm, still breathing, still able to smile. This was also a very important turning point in the journey of Thich Nhat Hanh. From here onward, what had once been nurtured in the meditation hall, in labor, in the suffering of war, in exile and loneliness, began to enter a language that ordinary people could also touch. He did not keep insight as a treasure reserved only for monastics. He brought it down to the level of the dining table, the kitchen, the office, the bus ride, the moment of waking in the morning, and the sleepless night. He did something very great by choosing a very small door, and perhaps it was precisely because that door was small that so many people dared to enter. We are often afraid of changes that are too great because we think we do not have the strength. But anyone can try a single breath. Anyone can try taking one slower step. Anyone can try setting down a little of the wandering mind in the present moment. From there, another kind of life begins to take shape. Not instantly radiant, but enduring, gentle, and more real. If we look carefully, this is not only the success of a book, it is the success of a heart that understood very clearly the weariness of modern human beings. Thich Nhat Hanh knew that most of us do not lack information. We lack a way to return. We do not lack advice. We lack a method gentle enough not to make us feel we have already failed from the beginning. We do not lack things to do. We lack a way of remaining peacefully with what we are doing. And because he understood that, he wrote, like someone lighting a small lamp at the bedside for souls who find it hard to sleep. But once a door has opened for each individual, sooner or later it also leads to a larger question. If one human being can be healed in some measure through mindfulness, then could many people living in that way create a different atmosphere for one another? Could peace cease to be only an individual experience and become a wider shelter, where the weary people of the age learn not only how to return to themselves, but also how to remain together, support one another, and breathe in the same deeper rhythm of stillness. There are ages that exhaust human beings not only through war or poverty, but also through another kind of weariness, more subtle than that, the fatigue of having to live too quickly, think too much, react too constantly, and little by little no longer knowing where to set one's heart down in peace. The modern world does not usually strike human beings with whips. It wears them down through haste, through noise, through unending demands, through the feeling that one must always become someone other than oneself. Perhaps Thich Nhat Hanh saw that very early. He understood that human beings need not only beautiful ideas in order to survive their age, they also need an environment gentle enough for those beautiful things to take root. A mindful breath is precious. A mindful step is precious. A book that opens a door for the soul is also precious. But if the life surrounding us remains nothing but haste, tension, loneliness, and fragmentation, then those seeds are easily blown out of the soil by the winds of life. And so, Plum Village came into being. The name alone already softens something within us. Not a fortress, not an academy, not the headquarters of a movement seeking to conquer the world. Simply a village, a small word, low to the ground, warm, close to the kitchen fire, close to the orchard, closer to the rhythms of human life than to grand slogans. Perhaps even in that name itself, one part of Thich Nhat Hanh's thought is already hidden. Healing does not necessarily have to begin with monumental structures. It may begin with a home that knows how to breathe, a dining table that knows how to listen, a dirt path where people slow down without feeling ashamed. Plum Village was not built as a place to escape the world. It was built as a place to learn how to return to the world without being swallowed by it. That is a very important point. Many people mistakenly believe that stillness can exist only if we cut ourselves off from life. But Thich Nhat Hanh seems to have followed another path. He did not deny the weariness human beings feel before modern civilization. He looked directly at it. He saw souls worn thin by anxiety, families living together yet no longer hearing one another, people outwardly successful in society, but inwardly like a room that has never been tidied. And he did not merely say, "Try to be at peace." He did something far more concrete. He built a space in which people could practice peace together. For there are things that are very difficult to sustain alone, but become possible within a community. A person who reminds themselves to eat slowly may forget. But when the whole table eats together in mindful silence, that slowness becomes a stream supporting each person. A person reminding oneself to walk at ease may be carried away by worry. But when many people walk together on a path, amid the sound of leaves and bells, that step suddenly gains greater endurance. A person trying to listen to the pain within may feel afraid, but when that person is seated among others who do not rush to judge, that pain begins to feel less alone. That is one of Plum Village's greatest gifts. It transformed mindfulness from an individual practice into a shared atmosphere. There, people are not asked to be perfect. No one needs to arrive with a soul already cleansed of every sorrow. On the contrary, perhaps those who are tired, confused, and lost are the very ones who can feel most fully the meaning of that place. Plum Village is like a wide porch open to those who have walked too long beneath the harsh sun of the world. Once they enter, they do not need to answer the great questions of their lives immediately. First of all, they need only sit down, breathe, drink tea, listen to the bell. Eat a meal that is not rushed. And for the first time in a very long while, they feel that they are no longer being asked to run. Within that very simple outward form lies an immensely profound idea. Community, too, is medicine. Not medicine in the sense of wiping away suffering in an instant, but the kind of medicine that helps human beings stop struggling alone. The kind of medicine that reminds us that peace is not merely the private achievement of the strong, but maybe the shared fruit of an environment that knows how to support. This becomes more and more precious in a civilization that worships the individual to the point of sometimes forgetting that the human soul is nourished by relationship. We need one another not only in order to work, but also in order to preserve the softest, most human part of one another. For older audiences, this perhaps touches a very deep place. For the longer one lives, the more one understands that there are kinds of weariness no advice can cure. A quiet sadness sometimes does not need further analysis. It needs a different atmosphere in which to dissolve slowly on its own. An uncertain old age sometimes needs not only medicine, but a place to sit with someone nearby. A heart that has passed through too many losses sometimes does not need to be repaired, but simply to remain in a place where gentle presence is still real. Plum Village, in that sense, is not merely a monastery. It is an affirmation that in a world so quick to exhaust us, there can still be homes built from the rhythm of breathing, from brotherhood and sisterhood, from very small yet enduring practices. What is even more precious is that Thich Nhat Hanh did not build this place as a paradise remote from ordinary life. He restored the very ordinary things of life to their sacred place. Walking, drinking tea, washing dishes, listening, sitting quietly, making a phone call in mindfulness, speaking a sentence in such a way that the other person suffers less. All of these gave people back their dignity. It is as if he were saying to the whole world, the path of healing does not necessarily lie somewhere far away. It may begin in the very way we live together through an ordinary day. And like every home built from sincerity, Plum Village could not remain only the place of one valley or one group of people. Once human beings have tasted what it feels like to breathe together in such a gentle atmosphere, that seed will sooner or later wish to travel farther, beyond the garden fences, across borders, into schools, hospitals, offices, broken families, and even into hearts that seem too weary to go on believing that gentleness could become a strength for the whole world. There are seeds that, when first sown, seem suited only to quiet ground. A silent garden, a deep temple, a morning of bells and thin mist. But then the years pass, the seed slowly grows, and we begin to witness something remarkable. There are things born in stillness that turn out to be precisely what the noisy world needs most. Mindfulness in the journey of Thich Nhat Hanh followed such a path. At first it appeared as a very intimate invitation. Breathe more deeply, walk more slowly, return to your body and mind. Then it unfolded into a community, into a home for those worn thin by modern life. But gradually, it no longer remained only on the dirt paths of the monastery, at the tea table, in the sound of the bell, or in meals taken in silence. It began to step outward, entering places that might seem furthest from the spirit of meditative practice: schools, hospitals, businesses, international forums, and even the spaces where power is often exercised through speed, pressure, and calculation. That was a very noteworthy step. For many people, for a long time, have believed that meditation is suitable only for those who wish to withdraw from the world. They imagine mindfulness as a kind of spiritual luxury, a gift reserved for those who have enough time to sit still. But Thich Nhat Hanh saw differently. He saw that the very places where people are making the most decisions, doing the most work, bearing the most pressure, are precisely the places most in need of being watered by deep presence. For if people act when the mind is completely scattered, decisions may be quick, but not necessarily wise. If people speak when inwardly they are filled only with unrecognized tension, their words easily become sharper than necessary. If an organization operates solely through efficiency without mindfulness, it may grow strong on the outside while cracking within. Perhaps that is why the mindfulness of Thich Nhat Hanh entered the modern world, not as a fashionable movement, but as a fundamental reminder. Human beings must be present before they seek to direct anything. It sounds simple, but it is a great challenge for our age. Modern civilization is very skilled at making people busy, efficient, and constantly connected, but it is not always skilled at keeping people whole within themselves. People may attend countless meetings without ever truly listening. They may send hundreds of messages without speaking a single word that touches the heart. They may reach a high position in a large structure and still live like exiles within their own souls. In such a context, mindfulness enters the centers of modern life, like a cool stream flowing through machinery that has grown too hot. But here, what is precious in Thich Nhat Hanh is that he did not turn mindfulness into a tool for helping people work more, only in a subtler way. He did not hand the world a technique for optimizing human beings the way one optimizes a machine. What he offered went far deeper. He reminded us that before being an employee, a leader, a doctor, a teacher, a policy maker, or any other role, we are still human beings with bodies that grow tired, with hearts that know pain, with fear, with wounds, with the capacity to make others suffer when we ourselves have not yet been cared for. Mindfulness, in that sense, does not merely help the modern world run more smoothly. It restores a very deep ethical question. With what kind of hand is power held? With what kind of breath? With what degree of wakefulness? That is what makes the thought of Thich Nhat Hanh not only gentle, but structurally profound. He understood that if we heal only individuals without touching the environments where tension is produced every day, suffering will continue to circle endlessly. Thus, when mindfulness enters schools, it not only helps students feel less anxious, it also softens the atmosphere in which young souls are growing. When it enters hospitals, it not only helps patients breathe more easily, it also reminds the caregiver that healing is not only the treatment of symptoms, but also the preservation of dignity for a human being who is growing weak. When it enters businesses or centers of decision-making, it not only reduces stress, it places a mirror in the middle of the whirlpool of power, so that people may see more clearly what they are creating in the world. And in this way, from the meditation hall, mindfulness has traveled very far. But what is remarkable is that the farther it travels, the more it returns to the most fundamental things. It is still that same breath, still those same footsteps, still the capacity to stop before reacting, to listen before concluding, to become aware of one's own suffering before unconsciously pouring it onto someone else. Perhaps that is precisely the enduring strength of the legacy of Thich Nhat Hanh. He did not bring the world a complicated doctrine that only the elite could understand. He brought a practice simple enough to enter daily life, yet deep enough to touch the very way a civilization treats human beings. For audiences who have lived through many seasons of life, this perhaps stirs a thought at once gentle and quietly sorrowful. Being in places of power does not necessarily make a person less fragile. On the contrary, the more responsibility one carries, the more one needs a heart that knows how to stop. The more one's voice affects others, the more one must learn how to speak from a place less filled with anger. And the more years pass, the more one understands a very simple truth. Without mindfulness, even success can become a form of being lost. Thich Nhat Hanh brought mindfulness into the modern world with just such a gait. No noisy confrontation, no conquest through force, only the patient opening of one small door after another. One person is breathing more slowly, one family learning to sit together, one classroom learning to listen more deeply, one organization is becoming less likely to treat human beings as tools, one leader learning to return to oneself before making decisions that will alter the lives of others. Little by little, the old seed from the temple courtyard passed into the very new corridors of the age. But every seed, no matter how far it travels, eventually longs to touch again the soil from which it was born. And sometimes, it is precisely when one draws near to one's roots that the deepest trials truly begin to show themselves. As if a lake, after many years of windless stillness, suddenly reflects once more the old clouds that had never entirely disappeared. There are returns that do not resemble the joyful cries of reunion. They do not open with flags and flowers, nor do they close every wound simply because one's feet have touched the old soil again. There are returns that come very slowly, very quietly, like an old leaf falling back to the root of the tree after many seasons of wind. And precisely because they are slow, because they are quiet, they reveal the deepest thing in a human life, what that person has carried through the years of exile, and how much gentleness that person has still managed to preserve after so much brokenness. The return of Thich Nhat Hanh bore that very form. After so many years in exile, after journeys through many countries, many hearts, many sorrows of humanity, he was able once more to see his homeland from nearer at hand. But this was no longer the return of a man who simply longed to touch the places of old again. It was the return of a human being who had passed through very great trials in life, being misunderstood, being separated, being placed outside the familiar circle of home, and still not allowing his heart to harden. That is what makes this return so beautiful. For anyone can be gentle when life is gentle with them. But to preserve forbearance after years of rejection, that is the true test of spiritual practice. Many people speak of forgiveness when the wound is still far away. But when the wound touches one's homeland, one's sangha, the things one holds most sacred, then forbearance is no longer simply a beautiful idea. It becomes a practice that carries a cost, and Thich Nhat Hanh seems to have paid that cost in silence. The events surrounding Bat Na, the fractures, the pain, the scenes that could make the heart of anyone devoted to the path of practice tighten with sorrow. All of these revealed a very sad truth. Even in places where people learn together about compassion, human beings can still wound one another. This is not easy to accept, for we always want to think that where there is light, darkness will no longer remain. But life is not so simple. Darkness sometimes follows human beings all the way into the temple courtyard, into relationships built from ideals, into places that seem already peaceful enough to be free from collision. It is precisely here that the greatest Dharma talk of Thich Nhat Hanh begins to appear. Not in a famous lecture, not in a book, but in the way he received pain without turning it into resentment. That sounds very light when written down, but anyone who has lived long enough to be wounded by the very things they cherished most will understand how deep a practice this is. For the natural response of human beings before hurt is often to contract or harden or demand justice in ways that cause the wound to spread wider. In Thich Nhat Hanh, by contrast, we see another path, not denying pain, yet also not handing over one's soul to be ruled by pain. Perhaps that is one of the reasons he became a teacher for so many people, including those who have never read all of his books. For in him, people could see that teaching and life were not separate from one another. He did not only speak of mindfulness when the weather was calm, he lived mindfulness in the midst of great winds. He not only preached forbearance as a lofty virtue, he allowed his own life to become proof that forbearance can exist right in the middle of the things that most easily darken the human heart. And thus, his return was no longer merely a matter of geography. It became a spiritual act, a confirmation that one can return to the place that once caused pain without returning as someone collecting an emotional debt. One can draw near again to one's roots with eyes that have seen brokenness and still preserve within that gaze a place for love. This is a very great lesson for our age. We are living in a culture that is very quick to condemn, very strong in dividing into sides, and very weak in its capacity to hold the complexities of human beings. The moment people are hurt, they easily want to sever ties. The moment they are disappointed, they easily want to erase everything. The moment they are in pain, they easily come to believe that bitterness is proof of lucidity. But Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us of something else. There is a kind of strength far more mature, the strength of one who looks directly at the wound without allowing oneself to speak forever in the voice of that wound. For older audiences, this perhaps touches a very deep region of lived experience. The longer one lives, the more one understands that the most painful blows do not always come from strangers. Very often, what exhausts us most comes from those near to us, from what is familiar, from the hopes into which we once poured our whole heart. And then the question of the latter half of life is no longer how not to be wounded. The question is, after being wounded, what kind of person do we still wish to become? Thich Nhat Hanh answered, with his very presence. He returned not as a victor, nor as a victim needing to be consoled. He returned like a river that had traveled very far, flowing through stone, through storms, through many strange lands. Yet when touching its homeland again, it still preserved the soft nature of water. It was precisely that softness that was most difficult, and it was precisely that softness that gave rise to the most living Dharma talk. For in the end, what human beings remember longest in a teacher is not only what that person said, it is the way that person was present when life was no longer easy, the way that person walked when body and mind bore many marks of time, the way that person kept a gentle gaze even after having had too many reasons to grow cold. There are teachings we must hear with our ears, but there are also teachings that appear only when we watch a human being live fully to the very end. And then, like a lamp that has burned through many nights, the body too begins to speak in its own language, slower, weaker, more fragile, as words gradually grow fewer, as the physical form is no longer as free as before. The light of a life of practice seems to reveal itself in another way, no longer in long talks, but in a silence deep enough that, by merely looking, people can feel their hearts soften like the surface of water at late dusk. There are stages in a human life when the body begins to speak before the mind. The legs move more slowly. The hands are no longer as agile as before. The voice grows thinner, sparser, sometimes no more than a faint breath. For many people, that is when they feel the most afraid, because this world often values human beings through strength, through the ability to do many things, say many words, and go many places. But the life of Thich Nhat Hanh seems to have quietly pointed toward another truth, gentler and deeper. When the body grows weak, the true quality of a life sometimes reveals itself most clearly after the years spent passing through war, exile, building sangha, writing books, giving Dharma talks, and supporting so many weary souls across the world. That body, too, had to follow the very ordinary law of being human, tired, aching, slowing, weakening. No one stands outside impermanence, not even a teacher who devoted his whole life to teaching others to look directly at impermanence. And perhaps it is precisely here that the teaching of Thich Nhat Hanh becomes more convincing than ever, because he did not merely speak about old age, illness, and limitation. He went through them by way of his own presence. What is moving is that when speech no longer came easily, when the body was no longer as free as before, he still continued to teach. But this was no longer a way of teaching through long discourses, tightly woven words, reasoning, or argument. It was the teaching of a lamp placed low in the night, saying very little, simply and quietly radiating a circle of light, sufficient for others to see the path and slow their steps. There are people who can inspire only while they remain strong, but there are also those who, when they grow weak, make the light within them even more refined. Thich Nhat Hanh belonged to the latter kind, for what remained in him was never merely the talent for speech or an extraordinary capacity for work. What remained was the quality of presence, a peaceful face, gentle eyes, a deeply quiet way of sitting, a fragility that was not hidden, yet did not complain. In him, people began to see clearly that the deepest strength of a human being does not always lie in the ability to act outwardly. Sometimes that strength lies here. Even though the body no longer obeys as before, one does not lose dignity, does not lose peace, does not lose the ability to soothe the hearts of others simply through one's presence. This is an especially beautiful lesson for older audiences. At a certain age, everyone must learn to become familiar with decline. Some lose their health, some lose their quickness, some gradually lose memory, lose initiative, lose the feeling of still being useful in the way they once were. And it is precisely there that a very quiet sorrow often appears. If I can no longer do what I once did, do I still have any value? Thich Nhat Hanh seems to answer that question with a whole life of practice, brought to ripeness. The value of a human being lies not only in what they do, but also in how they are. An old and weakened person who is truly at peace may heal more than a healthy person whose heart is full of unrest. A person who says very little yet is wholly present can sometimes transmit more comfort than 100 words of advice. A fragile body that does not resent impermanence can become a deep lesson for those who are still afraid of aging, afraid of illness, afraid of losing the version of themselves that once felt so familiar. In Thich Nhat Hanh, the weakening of the body did not cause the light to diminish. It merely changed the way it shone. That light no longer blazed like the sun at noon, but resembled an oil lamp in a dark room, small, warm, without glare, yet all the more precious as night deepened. People looked at him and saw not only an aging Zen master, they saw a human being living exactly what he had taught, accepting without resignation, dwelling in peace without fleeing, growing weaker without allowing the mind to shatter along with that weakening. Perhaps that is why the final stage of his life touched so many people, not because it was glorious in any outward sense, but because it was so real, so close to the fears of each of us. Everyone is moving in that direction, toward slowing down, toward letting go, toward a body carrying more limits than before. But in looking at Thich Nhat Hanh, people could become a little less afraid, for he showed that old age does not necessarily have to be only decline. It can also be the season in which the essence of life settles, becomes clearer, gentler, and more truthful. People often think the great lessons of a teacher lie in lofty ideas, but toward the end, Thich Nhat Hanh seems to have taught by something even more fundamental. Let impermanence pass through your body, but do not let it steal the compassion within you. This is not easy. When in pain, human beings tend to contract. When powerless, they easily fall into sadness. When more dependent on others, they easily feel themselves to be a burden. And yet in him, fragility did not turn into bitterness. It became a kind of transparency, as though after so many years of refinement, what was unnecessary had gradually fallen away, leaving only a very peaceful core. And from that, we understand more deeply something he once offered to the world. Life is not measured by the noisiness of outward movement. There are lives that are very strong while doing great things. But there are also lives that are very luminous while almost completely still. Like an ancient tree at the end of the season, no longer blooming brilliantly, no longer stretching its branches with force, yet simply by standing there, it is enough to let others know what endurance is, what roots are, what shade is. Seen in this way, the stage in which the body of Thich Nhat Hanh grew weak is not a marginal part of the story. It is one of the most beautiful, quiet passages in the whole journey, for there, every teaching on mindfulness, impermanence, dwelling in the present, relaxation, compassion, interbeing, no longer remained on the page or in sound. They were gathered into a deeply quiet presence, so that anyone slow enough could feel them. And then, when the light no longer needed to prove itself through words or movement, it began to enter a deeper region in the listener, a region where years, illness, loss, and the fears of the age could all be laid down a little more gently. From that place, the story is no longer only about how one human life was lived, but begins to open into a question more intimate for each of us. In these years of so much unrest, what shall we carry from him in order to go on more gently, more wakefully, and with less harm toward one another? Let the breath slow a little, slow like the lamp in the room being turned down one more notch, still bright enough for us to see the path, yet gentle enough that the heart does not have to stay awake too long with the agitations of the world. Breathe in, as though we are inviting stillness to enter. Breathe out, as though we are gently seeing off the weariness, the rushing news, the cold, bright lines on the screen, the invisible noises of a long day out the door, so that in this room there remains only the steady rhythm of breathing and the story of a man who devoted his whole life to reminding human beings to relearn the simplest thing, to return to themselves. And now, as the story of Thich Nhat Hanh has nearly completed its full circle, we return to the year 2026, our own age. An age full of light, yet not always warmth, so many connections, and yet so much loneliness. So many voices, and yet not always listening. So many tools for saving time, and yet human beings seem to live ever more deeply with the feeling that there is never enough time to truly live. If Thich Nhat Hanh were to look upon this age, perhaps he would not rush to condemn it. He was not the kind of person who stood above others in order to blame them for being weak, but perhaps, in a very gentle voice, he would show us a sad paradox of modern life. We hold the whole world in the palm of our hand, yet lose ourselves between touches on a screen. That is the first lesson he leaves for 2026. Protect your attention as you would protect a lamp in the wind. For a human life, in the end, is woven from attention. Whatever we give our attention to, our life will flow in that direction. If our attention is chopped into pieces by notifications, by waves of panic passed from hand to hand, by arguments that flare up and cool down within hours, then our inner life is chopped into pieces as well. One may be very up-to-date and still very lost. One may know a great deal about the world and yet no longer clearly recognize the sorrow lying in one's own heart. Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that peace does not begin when the world falls silent. Peace begins when we know how to stop, breathe one breath, and gather our body and mind back into one place. The second lesson is perhaps even deeper. Do not turn peace into a place of escape. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh lived throughout his whole life. He did not turn to the breath in order to turn his back on war. He did not speak of mindfulness in order to avoid suffering. On the contrary, he breathed more deeply so that he would have enough strength to look into suffering without being swallowed by it. In the year 2026, this becomes all the more important. Many people today want to heal in a hurried way, as though a few beautiful rituals, a few gentle phrases, a few carefully arranged moments of quiet were enough to escape hurt. But true peace is not a coat of paint over a crack. True peace is the ability to see that crack, to touch it with compassion, and then to go on living without allowing it to define one's whole being. The third lesson is what this distracted age is lacking in a painfully deep way. Human beings do not need only better techniques for living. They need a community in order to be less lonely. Thich Nhat Hanh did not only teach individuals to breathe. He built a sangha. He created spiritual homes. For he understood something very real. There are pains that are too heavy to hold alone. Yet when they are laid down among people who know how to listen, they suddenly become a little lighter. The year 2026 may offer us thousands of connections, but very few places where we can truly be present. A person may have many followers, yet not have even one person calm enough to sit beside them on a weary afternoon. That is a new kind of poverty in modern civilization. Not poverty of material things, but poverty of presence. And so, Thich Nhat Hanh seems to remind us, do not ask only how to become more successful, more efficient, more outstanding. Ask one more question, an old question, yet a very real one. Who is there to breathe with us through our hardest days? Without that question, life easily becomes a long corridor filled with electric light, clean, modern, and cold. The fourth lesson, and perhaps also the gentlest, is about impermanence. Our age speaks endlessly of control. Control of image, control of data, control of the future, even control of how others see us. But Thich Nhat Hanh devoted his whole life to reminding us of something modern human beings often do not want to hear. Nothing can be held forever by a tightly closed hand. The body will grow old. Those we love may one day leave. The times will change. And one day, we ourselves will have to learn how to let go, even of our own name, like a leaf letting go of the branch. It sounds sorrowful, but in truth, it is a liberation. For when we understand impermanence, we begin to love one another more. Rightly, we postpone kind words less. We waste less of our lives on small yet lingering angers. We are less likely to assume that we will always have more time to live more deeply someday. Thich Nhat Hanh did not teach human beings to fear impermanence. He taught human beings to live more beautifully, because impermanence is real. Perhaps that is the greatest gift he leaves to the year 2026. Not a doctrine to debate, not a formula for defeating others, but a way of living in which human beings become less distracted, less hurried, less likely to wound one another simply because they have never truly sat down with their own pain. He reminds us that in an age that loves acceleration, going slowly is a form of dignity. In an age that loves display, silence is a depth. In an age that loves immediate reaction, pausing for a single breath may be the wisest act of all. And now, as the night has lowered further beyond the window, perhaps we may close this story as we would close a thin book. Yet let its light remain upon our fingertips. Breathe in, knowing that we are still alive. Breathe out, knowing that we do not need to go far in order to find the way home. For sometimes the greatest lesson of a human life does not lie in how many upheavals they passed through, or how much influence they left upon the world, but in this: they showed the weary people who came after them a gentler way to live amid the noise, a deeper way to see amid distraction, and a kinder way to love one another before night falls.